They dressed her in gold. Not because she was happy, not because it was a celebration, but because the eyes of a continent were watching, and her silence had to sparkle. She was 6 years old, tiny hands wrapped in silk gloves, eyes that barely reached her husband's waist. A child married off, not for love, not for peace, but for power. Her name, Isabel de Valois, the daughter of a king, the pawn of empires. They said she smiled at the wedding, but who taught her what that smile meant? Who explained the words of the vows? Who dared to ask if she understood the man who would take her as a wife 20 years older? War-hardened, ruthless Europe watched in awe and horror. Whispers traveled from palace to palace, a child bride, to the most powerful monarch in the world, but no one stopped it. Not the Pope, not the kings, not even her own mother. By 15, she was a widow. But this isn't just a story of a young queen. It's the story of a girl fed to lions in the name of diplomacy, of a crown that weighed more than her entire body, of quiet suffering behind palace doors. Who was Isabel de Valois? Why did her life become a spectacle of sorrow? And how could one of history's most tragic marriages be so easily forgotten? This story is unlike anything you've heard. Madrid was not yet a capital. Paris was not yet the city of light. And Europe in the mid-16th century was a continent torn apart by blood belief and the brutal weight of crowns. The Italian War's decades of relentless conflict between great dynasties had left a trail of devastation across the continent. Two colossal empires stood at the center, the Habsburgs of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Valois kings of France. These were not battles for land alone. They were wars for dominance for the soul of Europe itself. Wars over who would hold the favor of the Pope, who would speak for Christendom, and who would decide the fate of kingdoms. Isabel de Valois was born into this chaos in 1545 at the Château de Fontainebleau, an exquisite cradle of art and politics deep in the forests of France. She was the third daughter of King Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, a woman both revered and feared, accused of poisoning rivals, manipulating courts, and clinging to power in a world ruled by men. Isabel wasn't the heir. She wasn't expected to rule, but she possessed something far more valuable to kings: diplomatic worth. In the language of royal courts, Isabel was not a child. She was a treaty waiting to be signed. At the time of her birth, Europe was weary of peace and too proud for compromise. Every negotiation carried the scent of blood. Every alliance required more than promises, it demanded sacrifices. King Philip II of Spain, recently widowed for the second time, had crushed the French at the Battle of Saint-Quentin. France, humiliated, was forced to come to the table. And from that bitter table emerged the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, signed in 1559. To end decades of war, the French agreed to a shocking condition: their 3-year-old princess would marry the most powerful man in Europe. Philip II was over 30. Isabel was a toddler. Imagine the cruelty hidden behind ceremony. A child too young to speak of death, expected to replace a dead queen. A girl barely out of swaddling clothes, handed over not for love or companionship, but to symbolize a fragile peace. Henry II accepted. Catherine de' Medici, ever the strategist, did not protest. And Europe, exhausted from the weight of constant warfare, chose silence. They needed a spectacle. They needed hope. So they staged a wedding with Philip's representative standing in for the groom. Isabel, dressed in white, was barely 4. But fate was not finished with the Valois. Just months after the treaty was signed, King Henry II died in a gruesome jousting accident. A splintered lance pierced his eye and entered his brain, killing him slowly, publicly. France plunged into uncertainty. His sons, young, sickly, or unfit, could not hold the throne. Catherine became the de facto ruler, clutching at control in a kingdom slipping into civil war. And Isabel, she became more vulnerable than ever. At 13, she was sent across the mountains into Spain. A foreign land, a foreign court, a foreign husband. Philip II, cold, devout, austere, did not want a partner. He wanted obedience. His home El Escorial was not a palace in the traditional sense. It was a monastery made of stone, a maze of shadows and prayer. It did not echo with music, but with whispers of penance. There Isabel was expected to transform, not from child to woman, but from person to symbol. She was now Queen of Spain. She was now responsible for maintaining a peace no one truly believed in. From the moment her feet touched Spanish soil, she was no longer herself. She was property. She was spectacle. She was burdened with a crown heavier than her body. And yet behind those quiet halls and gold-stitched gowns, something stirred attention, a fear, a truth waiting to surface. The tragedy of Isabel de Valois had only just begun, and her youth would not protect her from the cruel expectations of power. Not in a world where queens were meant to bleed, not speak. They said she was beautiful, not in the grand, intimidating way of queens, but in the disarming way of someone who was never meant to rule. Isabel de Valois had soft features, large, dark eyes, and a quiet dignity that unsettled people. She smiled, but only when it was expected. She spoke, but rarely, without permission. In a court defined by cold rituals and male authority, Isabel moved like a shadow, stitched in silk. By the time she turned 14, she had learned to speak Castilian with grace, not at the right moments, and hide every flicker of discomfort. She was fluent in diplomacy, but her voice was never truly heard. The Spanish court didn't want a queen who led. They wanted a queen who obeyed. And Isabel, child of France, was watched more closely than any prisoner. Philip II did not love her. He barely looked at her. Their marriage was solemn, distant, and chillingly silent. He had married her not for her heart, but for the ink on a treaty. He was twice her age, burdened by the ghosts of 2 dead wives, and married more to the church than to her. He ruled with a belief that kings answered only to God, and queens answered only to kings. And so, Isabel began to fade, not physically, but emotionally. Her laughter became hollow. Her letters home became shorter. Her walks in the palace gardens became slower, heavier, as if each step pulled her deeper into a place she could not escape. She was not allowed to leave the court without approval. She had no friends, only ladies-in-waiting who feared scandal more than they cared for her well-being. And in every hallway, behind every tapestry, she could feel eyes on her. The Spanish court, like much of Europe at the time, thrived on whispers. Rumors were as valuable as gold. And Isabel, young and foreign, became the perfect subject. Some said she was too French, too soft, too elegant to survive Spain's rigid moral standards. Others wondered why Philip had not yet produced another heir with her. Was it her fault? Was she barren? Was God punishing them for some unspoken sin? But beneath those whispers a darker truth waited. Isabel had begun to develop her own ideas, her own voice. Quietly, cautiously, she began writing letters not just to her mother but to other courts in Europe. She requested books that were not on the court's approved reading list. She asked questions about the Inquisition, about the treatment of the Moors and Jews. She showed compassion where she was told to remain cold. This, to the strict Catholic advisors of Philip II, was a threat. Confessors were assigned to her chamber. Her letters were intercepted. Her books were replaced. A quiet but clear message was delivered. Queens were not thinkers. Queens were vessels. Her body was Spain's. Her mind was not hers to explore. Still, Isabel pushed. She asked to see her stepdaughter more often. She advocated for kinder treatment of the court's lower servants. She even suggested attending meetings of state, not to vote or speak, just to listen. This was not received well. Philip, already irritated by religious rebellions in the Netherlands and pressure from Rome, saw Isabel's restlessness as dangerous. Then came the loss. Isabel became pregnant. The court rejoiced cautiously. An heir would secure her position. Silence would become celebration. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start. Isabel grew weak. Her appetite disappeared. Her eyes lost their light. The physicians whispered their prayers louder each day. She miscarried. The court did not comfort her. Philip did not grieve with her. She was expected to recover in silence, to bury her sorrow beneath the weight of royal duty. But the grief broke something inside her. She began to cry in front of her ladies. She stopped eating. She spoke to no one for days. The lightness in her step never returned. Still, time moved forward. She became pregnant again. This time the court prayed harder. But behind the smiles were cracks. Whispers returned. If this child didn't survive, Isabel might not either. She gave birth. A daughter. Not the heir they hoped for, but healthy. For a moment there was joy. Philip even allowed a brief audience to share the news. Isabel smiled, truly smiled for the first time in months. But the body that had given life had also given too much. Her health declined rapidly. Fever took hold. Her breathing became shallow. The palace grew quiet, save for the rustling of linen and the sound of last rites being prepared. Philip did not sit at her bedside. He prayed from afar. The same God he had married her for would now decide if she lived or died. And Isabel, just 15, barely older than a child, barely more than a symbol, began to slip away. There was no grand procession, no royal trumpet, or parade of mourning banners. Isabel de Valois died quietly in her bed just days after childbirth in the heart of El Escorial. She did not go screaming, but she did not go in peace. Her final hours were filled with fevered confusion, visions of her mother, of French forests, of white doves circling stained glass windows. They say she whispered in French as she faded words no one around her could understand. The room was cold. The windows had been sealed. Only the faint scent of lilies remained left behind by a lady-in-waiting, too afraid to cry. Isabel's body trembled until the very end, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of being a queen, too young, too far from home. Philip did not see her. He sent a priest. He prayed alone. The court, unsure how to mourn someone they had barely accepted, dressed in muted black and continued with their duties. Only her ladies, those who had watched her try to blossom in shadows, wept. But even they did so in silence. Her body was washed by gloved hands, dressed in silver cloth. Her hair combed straight, her face powdered pale. She was buried in the royal pantheon, her name etched into stone beneath titles she never chose. Queen, mother, consort. No mention of girl, no mention of sorrow. News of her death reached France weeks later. Catherine de' Medici wept in private. Not because she had lost a daughter, but because she had lost a piece of her strategy, her influence. France did not declare a day of mourning. Isabel's memory faded from court paintings. Her name was omitted from future treaties. Even the letters she wrote were burned by order of the crown. But a servant kept one. Just one. It was a letter she had written months before her final days, addressed to no one in particular. A diary of sorts. In it, she spoke of her daughter, of the hope she felt for her future, of the ache in her bones, of a dream where she was back in Fontainebleau, running barefoot through the gardens, free. Her words were soft but piercing. They do not know me here. I am not queen. I am not woman. I am shadow. But I remember light. The letter was hidden in a book, a volume of poetry she had requested in secret. It survived warfire and centuries of silence. And though her tomb is cold, those words still breathe. She was 15. The bells of El Escorial rang twice, once for the queen, once for the child she left behind. In the years that followed, Isabel de Valois became little more than a footnote in the chronicles of Spain and France. Her brief life, though tethered to crowns and treaties, faded behind the weight of empires. The courts moved on. The thrones she helped stabilize turned their eyes to new unions, new alliances, new pawns. Her daughter, the one she had died giving life to, was raised under the cold shadows of formality. She was loved, perhaps, but not the way Isabel would have loved her. Not with warmth or stories or touches on the cheek, but with tutors and expectations and a silence that came from never knowing her mother beyond the portraits. The women at court remembered. Quietly, in small moments, a look exchanged in a corridor, a hand brushed over a letter that should have been destroyed, a tear swallowed during Mass. They remembered the girl who smiled too politely, who walked too softly, who never truly belonged. But history did not mourn her. There was no movement to preserve her letters, no chapel bearing her name, no plays or songs or marble statues. She became what the court had always intended her to be, a symbol, and then a shadow. Even in El Escorial, where kings and queens sleep beneath stone, her tomb is as austere as the life she lived. And yet her voice survived. That single letter, the one tucked inside a forbidden book, was eventually found by a scholar centuries later. Its pages were yellowed, fragile, the ink smudged by time and perhaps by tears. The letter was real. The pain was real. And so too was the light she remembered. Modern historians began to ask different questions, not just about queens who ruled, but about queens who were sacrificed, about the girls whose lives were shaped by politics and erased by silence. Isabel de Valois became more than a forgotten name. She became a symbol of all the voices that went unheard. Today, she stands in the margins of textbooks, but to those who pause long enough to read, she speaks still, softly, but clearly. A whisper from a gilded prison, a memory carved in stone. Not just a queen, a girl, a life, a warning. And in remembering her, we remember all those history tried to forget. If this story left a mark on you, you're not alone. The tragedy of Isabel de Valois is one of quiet sorrow, buried under centuries of silence. But it's only one of many. There are other names, other voices, other forgotten queens who were never meant to lead, yet were forced to carry the burdens of kingdoms. If you want to know what happened to Catherine Howard, another young woman swallowed by a crown, click here to uncover the horror behind her final days. And if you believe these stories matter, if you think history is more than just kings and battles, then stay with us. There's so much more to uncover. Don't forget to subscribe. And remember, the past is never as distant as it seems.